Father, what do you mean by the word love?
Good question. Because love in our English language is a very unfortunate word because it has several meanings. It can be romantic, it can be filial love, it can be the love of friendship, it can be the love of an institution, it can be romantic love, it can be spiritual love. I'm thinking of it as love as a choice, that is, the will's choice is what I mean by love. And habitual love is the habit of choosing God in all our actions as they are appropriate. And implies making many mistakes, and it doesn't denigrate the other levels of love, all of which, the experience of which may be needed and helpful in gradually exposing oneself to the love of God, which is totally self-giving. So it's a choice of the will, but it's also a choice in which the self surrenders itself to God rather than seeks itself in the myriad forms in which human nature does that so well. Anyone else care to raise it? Yes. If you got to.
Do you consider the contemplative process in Christianity to be an extension of the Vedic traditions historically?
Being the extension of what tradition?
Vedic.
Vedic. Oh, I see. Yeah. I don't think there's any proven relation between the two historically, but there may well have been. What is striking, of course, that in the most developed of the Christian contemplatives, that there are great similarities with some of the experience of the East. The story I just told about the Buddha is really a parable of a non-dual attitude towards the ultimate reality. That is, the understanding of God as, while distinct from us, as also being one with us. And I think those ideas and Advaitic Hinduism or Vedanta, which holds that we become one with God in the course of the stages of enlightenment. These three great traditions tend to come together in a remarkable way without necessarily telling us whether they're talking about numerically the same experience. There are great similarities, but also significant differences. So I think it's too soon in the interreligious dialogue to determine whether they're all speaking about the same ultimate experience. But as far as the sources go, I don't think we can. I personally don't feel that we can identify the Christian experience as emerging from either Buddhism or the Hindu tradition. Okay.
When you were talking before about the kingdom coming in pain or in suffering or in the sinfulness, I got lost. Can you talk a little bit more about what that's about?
Okay.
Or was that something you talked about?
Well, what else is there to talk about? This is a subject that interests most people if they live long enough. Let's see if we can put it into an example. I have a dear friend whose child fell at an early age and whose brain development stopped at that time, so that this girl is totally paralyzed and can't speak. But she looks at you out of these wonderful eyes that are totally clear. It's as though you were looking into the eyes of God or maybe the Blessed Mother. She's totally open to everybody who comes into her life. She never says anything. She's just there and totally, apparently, accepting of her condition. And thanks to the extraordinary care, 24 hours a day, of her parents for now 26 or 7 years, she has no fear. Never experienced fear, as far as I can see, because they took such wonderful care of her. And so she's an example of someone who has remained, because of the love of her parents, at a certain period of childhood for the whole of her life. And so she manifests the value of being over doing. That is to say, to be a human being is infinitely more important than whatever you do, because every human being has such incredible dignity as the child of God and in whom God dwells. So this little person has become a member of our staff for the Contemplative Outreach intensive programs. So while our mother is cooking, she's sitting on the kitchen table there, or not sitting, she's lying down. And every now and then she goes into an ecstasy of laughter about something, I don't know what, usually about attention. But it's incredible the impression she makes on the retreat. Some have found it the most important aspect of the retreat, just to look at this little person. Well, the spiritual value that she unconsciously, can't take any credit for it because I don't think she knows how to reflect on herself. So she's one of the few creatures in the world who has no self-reflection, who just is. And this is so beautiful, especially to people in a state of retreat, that they're touched to their inmost being by that. And it's sort of the goal of what the retreat is all about. How to live with yourself as nothing. Jesus says somewhere, if you seek yourself, you will bring yourself to ruin. But if you bring yourself to nothing, you will find out who you are. That's the classic text for the second story I gave. Because when you bring yourself to nothing, you don't identify with your emotions or with your roles. And then you have the extraordinary freedom of being free from sin, free from the inclination to sin, free from all desires that are self-centered, until there's just plain freedom. The same state that Buddhist monk manifested in his chortling at these sacred events. This is not an invitation to start of making fun of the priests at Mass. That's not the point. Please don't laugh too soon. You might not have the same enlightenment as that Buddhist, and hence you won't get away with it. But she is an example of how perfect happiness is the freedom to be whoever you are and nothing else. To be yourself, which with enough experience turns out to be nothing. And when you're nothing, you become everything. Because then there's no obstacle to the divine, the true self manifesting God in you. And so to walk down the street or to take a cup of tea, go to the services, it's all the same. Because God is manifesting his love in every detail of your life. And this is the gospel ideal, I think, of being a Christian. That is, to being Christ-like.
Could you talk a little bit about how you see the relationship between the physical world and spiritual reality, and how that affects each other, impacts each other. Energy here. Talk about energy. That's what I want to hear.
Oh, yeah. Well, of course, this is a fascinating subject in our time. We're discovering a variety of energies, including great big ones and infinitesimal ones. But it would seem that the ultimate energy is spiritual. And some physicists even gone so far as to say the ultimate consciousness is love, which presumably means spiritual love. So that the creation seems to be a manifestation of ever more concrete or material energies, or energy materializing into concrete things. And some project that there's a possible return from that, the most concrete to the more spiritual, and that possibly this is one meaning of creation, but of course others claim that creation may go on forever, depending on what the relationship to the smallest kinds of material entities that have been discovered. But in physics itself is a kind of spirituality. The intensity or the search or the faith in always finding a smaller entity as the building block, ultimate building block of the universe, motivates some physicists almost to the degree that the spiritual life motivates some of us. So it helps us to remember that God is manifested not only in religious contexts, but as the source of everything. God can be found and sometimes relates more to people through nature, through science, through art, through the service of others, through spiritual friendship, through erotic love. Because all of these things are ways in which God relates to us and to our faculties. And the divine plan seems to be to relate to us at every level of our human development and consciousness. But always to bring us further on into ever deeper and greater ideas of God, and to ever more openness to the divine action within us, which prompts us to have the same concern for creation and others that the ultimate reality, whom we call God, has revealed about himself in the gospel and other great revelations. Perhaps that would suffice. Okay.
Father Thomas, I'm intrigued by the laughing monk. Is there any way that you could describe for us what it would be like to be in that experience of total freedom, the sense of being available to be in a situation where everything else is, as you said, dualistic? Is that a question? I'm wondering what it would, what a contemporary experience would be like of that kind of freedom.
Okay, well, I think that freedom was really what I was trying, though perhaps poorly, to suggest about the monks in Algeria. They were free to live in the present moment and to take whatever came and to manifest witness to God's unconditional love in staying in place and refusing to move out of the dialogue of not so much words, but of living with the poor Arabs around them. And so they didn't think about converting these Arabs. They didn't think about the glory of martyrdom, which they had no interest in. They didn't want to, as I said, have anyone responsible for their deaths, because that might cause that person some difficulty. So they forgave the killers in advance very explicitly. And this is the sign of the freedom that I think you're talking about. The capacity to be yourself and to relate to each moment out of the depths of your own sincere conviction of faith and love wherever God has brought you to this moment. And so that might involve staying in a relationship that is painful. Or it could involve getting out of one that is painful. In other words, you're listening not so much to customs or laws or rituals, but to the movement of divine love within, which might say, do this today and do that tomorrow. It's the flexibility to move with the gifts of the Spirit and with the freedom to choose either. So it's the freedom to choose whatever God wants with all one's heart that, to me, is the true freedom and the sign of contemplative maturity. And that isn't something to be won once and for all. The spiritual journey is a process. Everything is in process, I suppose, in life, but especially contemplative prayer, so that one reaches a place of great freedom and may experience the satisfaction, would you say? There really isn't a question of self-satisfaction, but the peace, I guess you'd say, that surpasses all understanding, that comes from being really free from outside influences and from the inside tyranny of the false self. But then God seems to say to himself, well, this person has really done well, but maybe they're willing to go a little farther. And so some of the sources of that freedom and peace seem to be threatened again. And you go through, kind of recycle the same old temptations or difficulties or feelings again, which doesn't mean you haven't dealt with them before and reached a certain peace, but means that God has a deeper self-surrender that he's asking of you, that he's prepared you for by these previous experiences of difficulty and struggle. And so I don't think the spiritual journey ever ends, frankly. I think one's attitudes towards it keep changing and relativizing, so that the intense confusion or pain or questions tend to be withdrawn or dissolved. But the actual challenge to ever increasing love of God, spiritual love of God, or the love that knows no self-concern, where we seek God not for any reward, but just for the sake of that he deserves all our love. I think that process can go on until we die, and perhaps afterwards. Because, after all, God is infinite, and it's a long trip from where we are to infinity, to perfect love. The thing that is most striking is that at some point, it doesn't bother you anymore that you're weak and poor and fragile and might sin, and might fail God. Because you're not thinking of yourself that much. You think only of manifesting God as much as he likes, and maybe he likes you as you are. And so you're willing not to be cured if that's God's will. And that's great freedom indeed. And so it's what pleases God that becomes true love, the true sign of spiritual love, I think. Well, it's 8:30. Ruth, what do you think?
You started 10 minutes late. One more.
Oh, sure.
Father Keating, I was intrigued by the story of the banquet, and at the end where he went out and forced the people from the country to come in. I was wondering symbolically, what does that mean in our lives? Could it be the paradox of where we have a choice, but in another way we don't? Something within us won't let us say no. Is that what does that mean? How does that work out?
Well, if no matter how powerful God's grace is calling us, there's always a moment of freedom to say yes or no, or at least in the beginning of the process. Now, once in a while, God's action may be so strong you have no choice, because it's sort of imposed on you with all its beauty, and you can't help but say, this is wonderful. I mean, this. But you also maybe have difficulty with the idea that God is forcing you to come in. I think this is not meant to be taken literally, because if God forced us all to come in, we'd all be contemplatives right now. All that this parable seems to be saying is that please don't think that this kind of intimacy with God is reserved for a few elite people. And please don't think that no matter what you've done in life, that you're excluded by some reason, mental, physical. Actually, your very infirmity or weakness makes you a better subject for this prayer, because it's clear that God loves those who are most in need. So the way to get the most out of God is to be the most in need, according to this theory. I don't recommend starting out to be the worst person on earth in order to have that mercy. But most of us experience that even when we're doing the best we can, we're a pretty sad sack. I mean, at least that's the way I feel. and so I don't think there's much. What we really need is the encouragement to know that whoever we are or think we are, God's love is invincible and is totally available if we open ourselves to it and ask ourselves to it. But it takes time for this conviction to become deeply rooted and for us to assimilate, because it's so extraordinary. It's such good news that we don't know what to do with that. All I'm saying is start out by doing 2 periods of centering prayer, and you'll find out. Or some method that brings you into this deeper relationship to God, which is beyond feeling, beyond thinking, and which is a kind of face-to-face or being-to-being, a communion with the ultimate reality of God that is already here, that dwells within us. So that actually seeking God, although it's a necessary expression in the beginning to get people started, is itself an obstacle to God, because God is already here. So there's nothing to seek, but only a total consent to what is. The deepest reality about us is the divine presence as a dynamic presence, as extending mercy and love and forgiveness and healing without end. And it seems to me that's the meaning of that marvelous parable. Jesus is trying to tell us the Father doesn't care who you are, because he loves you anyway, infinitely.